We are going to move into the question and answer part, and I'm going to start by reading from a chat question that I think was addressed to Gemma. It was written during her talk, and that was, can you speak to or provide resources or connections for simulant astromaterials?
Yeah, so we don't actually, in our office, we don't curate any non-extraterrestrial samples, but another branch in our division, the exploration science branch, they do actually have simulants that are available for request. Ryan, I think I saw in your browser you maybe had the link up for their website. If you could drop that in the chat. So you can reach out to John Grunner. He is the person who leads the simulant lab over in exploration science in Aries. So Ryan will provide you that link in the chat. And then I think John's name is probably down there somewhere, but we can also drop that in the chat. Encourage you to reach out to those folks if you want simulants. If you want extraterrestrial materials, where the folks to come to. But for the simulants, that is the exploration science branch.
Okay, great. Mary, do you want to read one of the questions that was submitted ahead of time? Mary, are you there?
I'm happy to read questions and make Ryan answer them if you would like.
I apologize. I was having issues getting to the right screen when I shared the PowerPoint. All right, so the first question I have is coming from Tanya Mikalik, and it says, are the special requirements things to be aware of for sample requests from European researchers?
Ryan, you want to take that?
Sure. Innate jealousy of the bread, cheese, and meat that you guys have in Europe that we don't have here in the United States. No, I don't believe there's anything in particular that is, a hang up for European or really any specific countries when it comes to requesting samples. So there's no special requirements for Europe.
You'll just get an international loan agreement instead of domestic loan agreement.
Exactly. It's like 2 paragraphs different.
Okay, then the next question I see in the chat is, starts out, thank you. What is the greatest challenge to astromaterials collection?
That is, I feel like that is a question we could talk about for a while. Ryan, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, it's about balancing, the wants of now versus the needs of the future to me. We always want to make sure we save some, both for smart people in the future, but for smart instruments in the future. But we want there to be enough samples available for the collection, for the community, so that, the community is healthy and robust. And so it's always just about finding that balance. And then when you get down to when you start to use up a lot of some of these smaller important samples, figuring out what do we want to make the last measurement on the creep basalt be, or what do we want to, that gets harder and harder. And so I don't know, those are my 2 answers.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's exactly what Ryan said. We have a job to protect the samples, but also get samples in your hands so you can all do the science that you need to do. And sometimes we have to make decisions that aren't popular with the broader community, but at the end of the day, the samples come first. So.
Okay, Mary, do you have another question there?
Yes, I do. Sorry, I'm just having trouble with the screen share. My bad. What are the key criteria for selecting researchers to receive sample allocations, and how can applications strengthen their proposal?
So for me, I'd say it's really demonstrating that you're qualified to do the research on the samples that you're asking for. That fundamentally is always going to be the first major hurdle that you have to get over. And writing a good proposal, I would say come back to the slide deck and this recorded talk when it's put up online and go through everything that Ryan said, because he really laid out exactly what you need to do to write the strongest, best proposal that you can the first time around. Ryan, I was going to ask if can you talk a little bit about the amount of feedback that people get? So say if they write a request and it's not successful, do people get feedback so they can improve their requests?
Yeah, and you'll get feedback whether you wrote a successful request or an unsuccessful request. If you wrote an unsuccessful request, the answer is never piss off and never come back. It's, all right, here's what you could do to make it better. You didn't address these following points, and please do so. And if you wrote a so-so request and you're like, okay, well, it was short here, 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 and here. Here's one sample for some non-destructive measurements that will help you have enough data to maybe write a better proposal. And so it is an iterative process where, if you ask for 10 samples, the answer is not yes or no. It's yes, no, or everything in between. And so, you ask for 10 samples, but, we really aren't convinced. And 3 would probably be where you start, and then use that data from 3 to show that you need more. Or you asked for 3 samples, but you asked for the wrong 3 samples. If you've ever been on a funding panel, it's different on a funding panel because money's involved. You cannot rewrite people's proposal. You cannot give them detailed feedback like this. But for sample use, you can. You'd be like, okay, I see why you asked for that soil, but that's just wrong. And here's why. And here's why it would be better if you use this. And so we're able to give that kind of feedback to people. And I think it helps most of the time. Try to be nice about it. Unless Cecilia is involved.
Cecilia is a delight.
Okay, so the next question in the chat is it recommended to list the most senior scientist as PI, even if a PhD or postdoc is putting together and most familiar with the proposal?
It's a case-by-case basis. We don't like to do loan agreements. These loan agreements are specific to the PI. The loan agreements are with the institution, not with the PI, but it's the PI whose name is attached to it. And we don't like to do loan agreements with temporary employees of institutions. And so it's different for different collections. Meteorite is a little more forgiving about this. Meteorite, we're a little bit more of a jerk about it. But so this is a case where it's an institutional PI, and the loan agreement will be in their name, but the science PI might be the postdoc, and they'll be included on or the primary point of contact for all the correspondence. And so it's really one or the other. And honestly, it shouldn't affect whether you get the sample. That part is usually handled by the curation office afterwards, where it's, all right, which of you is going to be the PI? Well, you're already a PI. Well, maybe we should send the samples to you as the advisor, because that will make everything go a little bit faster, and you won't have to wait 2 months while we get the loan agreement approved. So.
All right, the next question we have is from Ignacy Casanova, and he asks, are there different procedures to request meteorite and lunar samples, specimens, and thin sections?
So yeah, like I spoke about in my talk, and Ryan touched on, there are different sample request processes for each of the collections. So say you want samples from Meteorite and Apollo, that's 2 different requests. They don't go in together, they go separately. So yeah, you need to follow the specific request procedure for each of the different collections. And we don't bundle requests, they go to each of the specific different places. And then in terms of specimens and thin sections, there's no different, like say for Meteorite, you wanted thin sections or you wanted a chip. There's no real difference in the procedure for requesting them. You just have to specify that in your request, what you're asking for, what form it needs to be in, and then sufficient justification for why that's what you want. Ryan, is there anything you want to add?
No, don't ask for non-Antarctic meteorites from us. That does happen on a not infrequent basis, and it doesn't make your proposal look good, and we don't have them. So try not to do that. Try only to ask for the Antarctic meteorites. You can say, I will be including these non-Antarctic meteorites in the study, and I already have them, or I will get them from this other place. But don't ask NASA for stuff we don't have. That would be the only other thing I would add, which I forgot to say before.
Okay, is it, for the loan agreement, is that necessary for all institutions if instruments will be used at multiple locations?
That's a good question. No, usually we have a PI and then co-Is. And so if you're going to have, if you're going to have, say you're going to evenly split the samples between two PI and a co-I at two different institutions. For lunar, I know it's a little different for some of the other collections, but for lunar, we assign it to a PI and they are responsible for the sample. They're required to meet all the security requirements, sign the loan agreement. And then it will be outlined in the proposal that they're going to share the samples with the co-I and where, and then the co-I will be required to have the same security measures in place. And then we ask that they let us know when the samples move back and forth, but it always stays in the PI's name, and it doesn't flip back and forth to the co-I's name, because that becomes very challenging for us in a logistical, bureaucratic sense. If you're transferring it in a permanent sense, like if you're going to do the study and then you're done and then you're sending it on to your co-I and then they're going to hold on to it forever, in those cases, we might actually transfer the sample into the co-I's name because there's no expectation it'll go back and forth. So usually it's just the PI for a loan agreement for most collections, and then but security is required. Equal security is required everywhere.
The next question we have from Ignacio Casanova also is, how can we access the catalog? Is preliminary information, e.g. classification, preliminary analysis, published papers, provided in the catalog?
So you can find all of the catalogs on our website. I laid out in my talk for the different collections. Each one of the different collections has its own subset of pages. The catalogs are in there. The catalogs are all built differently with a different amount of information. So Ryan showed you how thorough Apollo is. There's a phenomenal amount of information in the Apollo database. Meteorite has a really helpful feature. If you go into the Meteorite pages, you find the sample catalog. For any specific sample in the catalog at the bottom, there's a list of publications. So this is something that Kevin Reiter did when he was our previous meteorite curator. Anytime a paper came out that published on an Antarctic meteorite, he went and put that in to the sample database. So you can go, say you're interested in DOM 08006, which is an amazing carbonaceous chondrite, and I won't hear Ryan besmirch in its honor. But if you were really interested in that meteorite, you could go to its page and you could see all of the work that has been published on it. And that's a great start for you to do your literature survey and see what has been done on it and if these samples are going to be useful for your purposes. And it's a little bit more up to date than the compendia are, because like Ryan said, they're about 10 years out of date at this point, but they're still useful resources for you.
Okay, we have one more question here, which is, how do you integrate the issue of the environment cautious with the activities performed?
I don't understand that question. Could you
Perhaps
word
it means the issue of environmental caution.
I would say that most of what we try to do is keep the samples as much like they were when they were collected as possible. And that requires that when we keep them all under nitrogen, we don't use a lot of other gas in terms of our process and stuff like that. And so, a lot of what we do in the lab is, fairly straightforward and doesn't require a lot of nasty chemicals or stuff like that. And so if that's what you're talking about, I think that sort of takes care of itself a little bit with the collections. So,
Mary, do you have any more questions?
Yes, there's 3 more questions. The next question is, what are the terms and conditions of loan for researchers outside the US?
Ryan, you're intimately familiar with the loan agreements. You want to take that?
Yeah, they're pretty much the same. The domestic and international loan agreements have almost exactly the same verbiage. They're between 11 and 12 pages long, and there's one or two paragraphs that get added into the international um, international loan agreements that have to do with the law that governs and how they're taken care of. So, but for the stuff that a PI normally cares about, like how you're required to handle the samples, what you're allowed to do to the samples, stuff like that. Those parts of the loan agreements are the same for both domestic and international. And I'm not familiar enough off the top of my head with the difference in the boilerplate language in the rest of the proposal to give that a full answer.
Mary, why don't you go ahead with the other two questions you have?
Sure. The next question says, how can we find information on the samples available for loan and the allowable quantities for each sample? Is it available to loan samples that are listed in the Relab spectral data catalog, especially samples with the same parent and daughter numbers but sieved by grain size?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it's not actually an easy question to answer. I think you'll notice out of everything that was in my presentation, I was very non-specific about the mass that I listed, and that's because it varies quite widely across collections. Where meteorite and lunar samples, which are larger, then asking for multiple grams to do a measurement is not unheard of. Asking for tens of grams, especially in lunar, is almost never done, and asking for hundreds of grams, I can only think of one or two in the last 20 years that were successful. And so, in general, for meteorites and lunar, you're requesting these on the order of fractions of a gram or a few grams. And it's about demonstrating, that you need that much and why. When it comes to trying to match your data to say what you're seeing in the literature. So the Relab, if they've done spectroscopy on 70017, and you want comma 1, we'll be happy to loan that to you if it still exists. And if it doesn't, we know enough about the history of the sample that we can usually find a sample from near it or that's at least applicable to what you're trying to do. And but that's really important. And don't just say, I want that sample that Bob studied in 1985. I swear to God, I got that in a request one time and it almost killed us trying to figure out what that sample was. So saying you want sample 70017, or whatever, and you give the reference and when is super important and super helpful as we try to match specific subsamples from the collection to pre-existing data.
Thank you. The last question we have is, are there specific environmental requirements for the loan of samples, including those previously exposed to air, such as the use of glove box or other controlled environments?
The major requirement is that you keep the samples safe once they're in your possession. We don't require people to then, work with them in, say, like nitrogen atmosphere in a glove box or something like that. We assume when these are allocated to you, they become non-pristine. So, we don't have really stringent requirements on that. But Ryan, anything you want to add?
Yeah, the only exception to that would be that if the measurement you're making requires special handling, and we know that, and you're not planning to handle the samples that way, well, that's going to be a problem. If you want to make some kind of spectroscopic measurement where you want to see how much water is adsorbed into lunar regolith, and you live in Houston and you're going to keep the samples, in an unconditioned room, well, that measurement's probably not going to be very valid. And so the only exception to that would be, we expect that you will treat the sample in a way that enables the science that you propose, and that should be demonstrated in the request. And that's across all the different collections.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of ties into best practices for handling any kind of astromaterials. It's common for people to use desiccators to keep their samples in. So, don't leave them lying around, keep them safe, and keep them in as clean an environment as you can. But we don't have super draconian rules about this must be in this class of clean room with this, level of glove box developments.
Okay, Mary, could you now put up the final slide? Well, okay, while it's coming, I think we're out of questions, and I would just like to thank both Gemma and Ryan very much again. I do want to remind you that the second series, or the second presentation time in this series is next week, Wednesday, same time, 1 o'clock Central Time. And the speaker will be Dr. Aaron Burton of NASA headquarters. He'll be talking about the Planetary Sciences Enabling Facilities program. I wanted to make a couple of comments about other LPI events. Gemma mentioned our small sample handling training that we've been offering in conjunction with Aries JSC for a number of years. And I just wanted to confirm that there will be another one coming up sometime in the spring of 2025. And then I wanted to point out our next actual event, which is a workshop or a series of invited lectures on the subject of Itokawa. Gemma talked about Itokawa and the dawn of asteroidal sample return. This will be held in late January. And you can learn more about that by going to our website, which is shown here. So thank you again, Ryan and Gemma, and everybody else who sent in questions and listened.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you for the great questions, and we're looking forward to seeing your awesome sample requests.